One of the most terrifying opponents you can encounter in the Wastelands of post-apocalyptic America are Super Mutants, and in this video we're going to be showing you how to paint one for Fallout Wasteland Warfare by Modiphius Entertainment. Now, one of the most distinctive features on these creatures is their horrible sickly green skin, and we're going to be showing you exactly how to paint it to get a really horrible finish to it that looks super cool as well. One that you can use for a whole warband of these miniatures. And as well, this is a video that Roger and I are really excited for because we both love Fallout, and in fact if you like narrative gaming, Fallout Wasteland Warfare is a game that you should definitely check out. But anyway, with all that out of the way, let's get to the desk. To paint your Super Mutant, as ever, the first thing to do is to undercoat your model, and for mine I've gone for Mechanicus Standard Grey from Citadel, which is my nice standard go-to colour because it's a great mid-tone and loads of colours apply over it really well. However, all you need is a nice standard mid-tone like this, so something that's nice and neutral like Death Guard Green, for example, from Citadel, or Uniform Grey from the Army Painter will do absolutely fine here, and we are going to be painting over most of it, so the exact colour doesn't matter a great deal. Now, before we do start actually putting any paint on the miniature, I just want to point out that we're painting one of the resin miniatures from Modiphius. And the base on it is quite a large one, and you can see I'm using one of these Citadel painting handles here to hold the miniature whilst we're painting it. Now, the grip vise here at the top can open wide enough to hold this base, but it does go to the absolute extreme to do it, and I don't want to damage the resin of the base. So instead, what I've done is just stuck it to some adhesive putty on there, which means I can still use it, but I won't damage the base at all. And with that out of the way, we can now start actually putting some paint onto the model, and we're going to start out with some base coats, the first of which is going to be for some of the rags on these creatures. Now, the exact colour doesn't matter a great deal, but some sort of brown is perfect for this. And I'm going to go for Gorthor Brown from Citadel. Really nice tone for this kind of thing, which you see often in the video games for these creatures. And to apply it, what I'm going to be using is a regiment brush from the Army Painter. So a nice large brush that will allow me to cover a large area nice and quickly. And as always, we just need to get some paint onto the palette, diluted with a bit of water. There we go. And once that's done, we're then ready to start applying it to the miniature. And it's really up to you exactly whereabouts you apply it for the rags. Just pick a layer and go for it. I'm going to start for this one here that goes around the waist. So just starting around about there and then working my way around, just looking for where it disappears beneath other details and reappears later on. So this one actually goes around about there and it goes a little bit higher up here. So you can see how I'm not concerned about other details for now, because we will be base coating those as we go along. I just want to make sure at this stage I get all of these rags on this layer going around this area. And there we are, we've now painted some of the rags, but that isn't the only layer of them. So what I'm going to do now is pick another brown to do a little bit more. So I've picked the appropriately named Monster Brown from the Army Painter for this, and I just want to get a little bit of this because it's mostly the same thing as what we've just done. So just get a little bit of that onto the palette, stick to that regiment brush to apply it, and like before, what we want to do is just get a little bit of this ready, and then start using it to pick out some other areas. And what this is going to do is just break up the various layers of these materials, so it adds more interest to the model and helps various details stand out. And in the case of my miniature just here, the rags I'm talking about now are down here around his feet. Now with this done, that'll be all the layers of rags that appear on this miniature done, so we'll move on to painting other details, but depending on which Super Mutant you're painting, there might be some more of these, so if there are, feel free to grab some other colours, other shades of brown, and just use them to pick them out in the exact same way. And there we are, I've now finished painting the rags and we can move on to base coating some other details on the miniature. And it's going to be using the same techniques what we've just been doing here, so we're going to run through them quickly for you now. First of all, we need some Rhinox Hide to paint in leather, followed by some Zandri Dust to get all the bones started out. After that, we're going to be moving on to some Steel Legion Drab to paint the wooden details on this model's pistols, and then finally we need some Leadbelcher for all the metal details. Now, first of all, we're going to be using Rhinox Hide, and this is going to be for the leather. And of course, we have been using quite a few browns so far, but they're all quite neutral ones. This one, however, is going to be highlighted with much more warm tones, so it's going to stand out as being very different from the rags that we've done so far, which is why we've switched to such a different colour here. And what we need to do is get a little bit more control over it this time, so I'm using a medium layer brush from Citadel, and I'm just making sure the paint's flowing very smoothly from the brush there. There we go. So with this, what I'm looking for is all the leather straps on the miniature, which, well, you can see there's a belt going around his waist, which is just here. And it goes to these pouches around his waist as well. And you'll find that on these miniatures, the actual leather details vary quite a lot from model to model. So you just have to carefully look around the miniature to make sure you catch them all. But in this case, it's going to be areas such as just here, and also this leather cap that he's wearing up here. I'm going to be painting all of this too. With that done, we're then ready to move on to Zandri Dust, and this is to base coat any bone on the miniature, for example the skulls that we've got on this one. Next up, we're ready to base coat any wooden details in the miniature, for example these wooden blocks that are on the pipe pistols. And finally, using Leadbelcher, base coat all the metal details on the miniature. Now the metal details will vary quite a lot from model to model, so just take your time checking them carefully to make sure you catch them all. Once you've done this, just give a quick once over on the model as well to see that you've got all the rags and all the skulls and things like that. And once you've done so, we'll move on to the next step. Once you're happy with all your base coats, you're then ready to move on to the next step, which is to wash all the colours that we've got so far to give them more depth and definition. And for this, what we want is a sort of dark brown wash, so it gives a nice oily finish to things. And I'm going to be using Agrax Earthshade for this, for which I'm going to be applying it using a medium shade brush from Citadel, because it's a nice large brush, cover a large area very quickly, perfect for this kind of thing. Now I like to use a palette when I'm using this kind of paint to help me control how much I'm applying at once, but you can go straight from the bottle if you want to. Either way though, all you need to do is start applying this all over your miniature so that it settles nicely in that recessed detail like that and gives it all that nice definition. Now for things we've not painted yet, for example rope or skin, don't worry about those details because we are going to paint those later on, but it is important that as you apply this you just keep an eye on where it's settling, because it's possible if you get a lot of it in one area such as that, it can really clog up the area, and if it dries like that it'll give a really horrible finish. So if you spot that kind of thing happening, just move away the excess paint like that and redistribute it elsewhere around the miniature. Once you've finished applying the shade all over, give the miniature around about 45 minutes to dry before you move on to the next step. Once the wash is completely dry, you're then ready to move on to the next phase, which is to highlight these colours that we've got on here. And to begin with, we're going to focus on that metal, first of all by dry brushing it to really bring out the texture on it. And for this, what I'm going to be using is some Necron Compound, which if you're going for a metallic dry brush, this is a brilliant paint for it because it keeps a nice shine to things. And for the brush, I'm actually using this large dry brush from the Army Painter, and I'm specifically using this one because of this chisel tip that we've got on here. It's very important for this, you'll see why in a moment. But the dry brush, what we need to do is just get a little bit of this paint onto the brush like this, and then get some tissue and use it to work the paint into the bristles. There we go, we don't need loads. But once we've got that in there, what we're now going to do is start dry brushing this onto the metal to bring out that kind of rough battered texture that is so important to Fallout miniatures. And you can see there's quite a lot of it on the metal plating we've got on here. Now this is the reason why I'm using this brush. It's because of that point. It means I can angle the brush to give myself more control over things. So it's got a bit of a wider surface for larger areas such as around here. So I can very gently go across that part of the metal there to bring out that detail there. When I get around to areas such as here where I've got things like the skull and the leather where I want to avoid them, I can angle the brush like this and it goes to a much finer point, which means I've got much more control working into those smaller areas like that. So you see, I can just take my time wherever I build this up. It just makes it a little bit shinier and just brings out that battered texture of the metal. So what you need to do now is just carry on doing this on the armour plating. Don't worry about things like the pistols or the goggles up there. Just look for these armour plates where it's all battered and dented and just lightly brush across them like this. I finished that dry brushing now, and you can see it's really helped bring out all that shape of the metal. And to really finish it off, what we're going to do now is add a highlight to it of Stormhost Silver. And for this, because we only need a little bit, I'm going to be using a small airbrush from Citadel to apply it. And what we need to do is, again, just use that palette to thin the paint down. There we go. And then once you've done so, what we're looking to do is to pick out the edges and parts where the light catches on the metal. So, for example, if we take a look at that area we started dry brushing first to begin with, around here, what I can do is use the side of my brush just to quickly skim around the outside edge like this. It doesn't have to be super neat along the metal. I mean, obviously avoid the other details, but because it's so rough, if you just like sort of space it along like this, it just helps build that rough texture of the metal. But you see, doing this just gives it a little bit more shape and definition and helps that part stand out from the rest of it. Now, there's other areas where light is catching a lot on the metal. For example, these two ridge parts we've got along here. What I want to do is just help pick some of those out a little bit as well, with just a little bit of this colour running around the edges there like that. Now in addition, we can now start highlighting all the finer details that we couldn't quite reach when doing the dry brushing. So for example, on the goggles, I can just use the side of my brush to skim on the raised texture of that part around like that. And we can also now highlight the pistols, again looking for the edges and just picking them out as neatly as possible. And there we are, the silver is now highlighted and looking great. A little bit too clean perhaps, but don't worry about it because we are going to come back to it later on to add some rust to it. Because what we need to do now is to highlight those other colours that we've applied to the miniature. So for this, first of all, we're going to use some Baneblade Brown, which is going to be used for all those rags. And then after that, we need some Doomball Brown for the leather. With that done, we're then going to actually use a contrast paint called Wildwood, which we're going to use to pick out all the various bits of thread on the miniature. And then finally, we need some Ushabti Bone to highlight that thread and also the skulls on the miniature too. But first of all, what we need is that Baneblade Brown, and so again I'm going to use my small layer brush because what we want to do is just pick out the finer features on all the rags here. So things like the tops of the folds and creases, that sort of thing. So once you've just got a good point on your brush, you've got to look for details such as that. And on this miniature, we do of course have two different shades of brown for the rags, but we're going to highlight both of them at the same time with this, with the same technique. What you do is look for the edges going all the way around the hem, so you can see where it's all torn around here. I just want to follow that edge just very gently using the side of my brush. And also keep an eye out for any creases on it. So you can see we've got some creases running up here. In this case, what I want to do is just run the colour just along the very tops of them like that to help those details stand out. Now, in addition, we want to make sure at this stage that we look out for any bits of rope, such as the one going around his waist just here, and be sure to base coat that as well. Next, we need a small amount of Doomball Brown, and this is to highlight all those leather details, the ones that we base coated with Rhinox Hide originally, such as the belt and the pouches around here. Next, we're ready for a little bit of Wildwood, which is a contrast paint that we're going to use for a few things. First of all, we want to use it for any bits of binding on the model. For example, around the pipe pistols, you can see just here, what you do is just paint this over these threads like this, just to give them some definition and darken them down in preparation for the highlight, which we're going to be applying later. Now, in addition, we can use this colour to help add some fine lines, really, breaking up some details if they merge a little bit. For example, you can see this belt and the rags just there. I want to separate them a tiny bit, so what I can do is paint a small amount of this into that corner like that to give some more definition. Finally, it allows us to hide any details that we want to just sort of get rid of, really. So, for example, underneath the rags, you can see there's like a solid block of resin just down there. We don't want people to notice that, so what I'm going to do is just paint some Wildwood over here to create some shadows and just help hide it a bit so that you don't see it when you're just looking at the model. And finally, we need some Ushabti Bone for, once again, a few details. First of all, we're going to use this to paint the skulls, and for this we want to do a layer. So what we need to do is apply a thin coat across the forehead like this, and then as we get down to the facial features just around here, just very gently skim your brush on it to catch those little details like that, like the teeth, around the nose, around the eye sockets, that kind of thing like that. Now also there's a few other areas we need to pick out, and once again we need to go back to that binding. For this you can see the one around the pistol there. Just use the side of your brush just to very gently just flick across it like that to catch the raised areas and just to give it a nice bit of definition like that. In addition, we want to do this to the rope, so the rope around his waist. Once again, just use the side of your brush just to gently skim it so that you catch the raised texture of it. And there we are, with that done, we're now going to leave those details and move on to painting the main feature of the Super Mutant, which is of course their green skin. Now to do this we need to start out by establishing the mid-tone for it, which in this case is going to be Loren Forest, which is one of the paints from Citadel. Now to apply this I'm going to be using a Citadel brush mostly, a medium layer brush, but it's a good idea to have a smaller one on hand for some of the finer detail, so a small layer brush will be perfect here. This is in particular for this certain miniature because it's quite tricky to get to a lot of the detail around the armour, so that's why you want the finer brush, and of course just take your time with it. But as always, to get that paint ready, and once you've done so, it's just a matter of blocking in all the flesh. Now as you're doing this, don't go right into the little corners and recessed details, just keep a distance away from them like this, so we keep that definition from the shading that we did earlier on with the Agrax Earthshade. But aside from that, it's just a matter of looking for the flesh and painting it with this colour, and you can see it's a little bit thin, a little bit transparent. It's not a problem though, just apply this first coat, let it dry, and apply a second thin coat in the exact same way. With that base coat done, we can now move on to the next step, which is to get some more definition on that muscle. And to do that, we're going to start out by shading it. But rather than using a wash paint like we normally do, instead what I'm going to do is use a layer paint from Citadel called Vulkan Green. This is a darker green, which we're going to paint into the recessed areas. And the reason why we're doing this rather than using a wash is because a lot of the detail on the flesh of this miniature is very fine. And so we want to make sure that the paint basically stays where we want it to be. Now, once that's done, we're then going to move on to Loren Forest once again, which we're going to use to neaten things up again. But first of all, we need that Vulkan Green. And to apply this, I'm going to be using a small layer brush from Citadel, and I'm going to thin it down with a little bit of water like how we normally do. There we go, so it's a little bit runny. You can see it's quite a transparent layer paint. It's actually very useful for what we want to do here. Get rid of the excess off your brush and then start looking carefully on the muscles for recessed details, which you can see the shadow is sort of catching. So for example, if we look at this arm here, you can see there's quite a bit of it, and it really follows the texture as well around the elbow just there. What I'm going to do with this colour is just start painting it into these recessed areas like this. So just very gently, just letting the brush just fall into those areas, not worrying about being too neat at this stage because we are going to neaten up in the next step. But you can see just doing this, I'm able to control exactly where the shading happens and start to bring in a bit more definition on things. I want to make sure that we go around to darker areas just between the fingers as well, so just run it into those parts, such as around there. But when we get to the other textures on the miniature, so around here, remember in the previous step how we didn't go all the way to keep that darker line between the rags and the flesh. I want to keep that darker line there as well, so I'm not going to go all the way into the recess, I'm just going to go very, very close to it like that. If you do happen to go right into that corner, it's very easy just to jump back to a little bit of Agrax Earthshade, just to dot it in that corner to separate the two. But you can see if you're neat, then you can just avoid doing that step. But really all it is just a matter of looking around the flesh, looking for those darker areas where shadow is just settling, and just gently running this paint into those parts. Once you finish that step, you're then ready to return to Loren Forest, but this time to layer it onto the muscle. And what I'm looking to do here is to neaten up any areas where I splodged a little bit with the Vulkan Green, areas where when you paint into the recess it would lip up onto the flat of the arm or the muscle. So you can see on the arm just here I had a little bit around there, so just by applying it there like that and then leaving it darker in the recessed areas, I keep that definition. This also helps develop a nice smooth transition from the darker areas to the lighter areas, especially useful in very smooth parts of the muscle. For example, just on here to get that nice transition from where it's really dark down there to where it's a bit lighter on top just here. There we are, I've finished neatening up that skin and you can see we're getting some definition there, and now we're ready to start to highlight it. And for this, the colour we're ultimately going to be using to highlight the skin is Skarsnik Green from Citadel, but this is quite a jump from Loren Forest. So what we're going to do is first of all apply a mix of this. Now if you have a wet palette, you might want to use it for this stage because it will keep the mix a little bit wetter, a bit longer, and so you won't have to mix quite so much paint. But I'm just going to stick to my palette for this. And what I'm aiming to do is do a 50-50 mix. So here's my Loren Forest first of all, and to get this ready I'm using a larger brush. This is the Regiment brush I used earlier from the Army Painter. And then I want to get roughly equal amount of Skarsnik Green. And this doesn't have to be exact from model to model because changing this ratio will vary the skin tone ever so slightly, and that's absolutely fine for these creatures. So just get it roughly half and half. There we go. And then start mixing them together. And then to apply it, what I'm going to do is return to my small layer brush for applying it from Citadel. So there we go. That's a pretty good mix just there. Okay, and there we go. So I'm just going to dilute it as we normally do with a little bit of water. Just a tiny bit more. There we go. And then to apply this, what we're looking to do is to, well, consider a source of light from the top of the miniature, because we're going to use it to exaggerate the shape of the muscles here. So if we take a look at the arm that we've been focusing on around about here, what I want to do is think about the light coming down and catching the curve of the muscle, but not going underneath. So what I'll do is just turn the model so it's a bit more of a natural feel for me to get to that area of the muscle. Just check my paint. There we go. And what I'm going to do is apply this along that top of the curve of the muscle, so just along there like that. And then leave the Loren Forest showing beneath it as it gets darker, then down towards the Vulkan Green and any recesses. So you see this way, I'm exaggerating the shape of the muscle. And I just need to carry on doing this around the miniature. So it's going to be a little bit there as well. And around there and along there. A little bit along there like that. So you see it's always the same process, just working my way around. And you can see the more I do this, the stronger the colour gets. And the more the shape starts to become exaggerated and the more definition we get on the muscle. Now if you find it's a little bit too stark, you can always go back to Loren Forest and just paint over the join between the two colours, and that will help blend them together. But just taking your time like this, it's quite nice just to start to really emphasise the shape of it and build it up where you want it to be. Now same is going to be true on the legs, on the toes, on the hands, all these areas, and on the face. Whilst you're doing this, just use it to help really bring out the expression of the miniature too. So we want to do things such as like on the nose just there, and on the brow where the light's going to be catching just there. And then we got the cheekbone just down here, and it really sort of goes in quite a lot right beneath there. So I'm going to skip that part and instead just start going down the side of the mouth. So you see, it's all a very gentle process, this, just taking my time, just looking for those curves and picking them out. I've finished applying that highlight now, and you can see the muscles are really now starting to stand out. And with that done, we can move on to our next highlight, which is just going to be Skarsnik Green on its own this time. Now this time we're going to be doing some much finer work here, so we want a smaller brush. I'm going to use a detail brush from the Army Painter for this. And we just want to be getting small amounts of this, because really we want to paint this only on the parts where most of the light is going to be catching. So very fine parts now. So make sure you got your paint so it's under control. And then what we're looking to do is to add this just on the very extremes of the areas that we were highlighting previously. So if we go back to that arm once more, again like before, I'm just going to turn the model so it's a nice comfortable motion for me to do, sweeping down like that. All I'm going to do is paint a thin line of this on the top of that muscle there, following the crest of it like that, And then again on the top of here where that light's catching along the top like that. And then on this muscle just here. So you can see what it's doing is just building that effect and exaggerating the difference there from the shadow to the light, especially as it starts cresting over there. It's light at the top and gradually it's darker the further down we go. This is also a great opportunity to pick out the bits of texture such as the wrinkles we've got here. So I can just follow them along the tops like that. Again, just to paint towards the top where the light's going to be. And along there, and you can see now this is really bringing that arm to life, really bringing out the shape of it. When we get to the face, it's also a great opportunity now to really bring out the expression. So for this, I'm looking at, again, those parts where light is going to be just cresting over, so areas such as the nose there, the brow just along there. I want to just pick out that cheekbone, so around about there, like that. And then leaving it darker where it recesses in beneath it, and then a bit further down the chin. So you can see now, just doing this very delicately, very gently, it's really bringing it to life. And there we are, the green is highlighted and now ready to paint in some finer details on the flesh. And for this, first of all, what we need is a small amount of Bugman's Glow, followed by a little bit of Cadian Fleshtone, and then we're going to use some Screaming Skull, which is just going to be for the teeth on the miniature. But first of all, we need that Bugman's Glow, and I'm again going to use my detail brush from the Army Painter to apply this, because this is some very small detail now. You don't need very much of this. So just make sure you use the palette to help with that small amount of paint at the tip of your brush just there. And what we're looking to do with this is to paint it on the softer areas of flesh. So for this particular miniature, that's going to be the lower lip and also the lower eyelids as well. So we want to just run a bit of this colour just across this area just here. Now in your miniature, if you can see the palm of their hands, that's also a great place for this, but you can see it's just represents that little softer areas of flesh. The bits that move quite a lot. So areas such as just along there. Now for the eyes, like this one, if you can still see a little bit of green in the actual eyeball itself, once you've painted this in, just get a little bit of wildwood like we were doing earlier on and just run it into the deepest recess of the eye. Next, we're ready to add a little bit of Cadian Fleshtone, and this is mostly optional, but really it's a great little colour for a fine highlight on areas of skin where it's a bit drier. So for example, things such as the knees down here where you've got this texture, just using it as a very final highlight, very delicately, just to add a slight difference of skin tone on those parts. Now in addition, there's another optional thing you can do with this colour, and that is to paint on some little veins onto areas of muscles. For example, these open ones we've got here, you can just do some little jagged lines on here, which will get toned down a little bit later on, but what this does is just adds a really horrible subtle effect, just like you can see on the games. And then finally, we just need a small amount of Screaming Skull to pick out the teeth. So just very gently just poke at the texture along here like this. Now, also at this stage, we want to use Screaming Skull to highlight the skulls as well. And for these, all you need to do is pick out the facial features. So following around just along here on the brow, and of course the teeth down here as well. And there we are, the fine details are painted in, and at this point the skin is almost finished, but not quite, because what we want to do now is give it that horrible irradiated feel that's perfect for Fallout. Now to do this, what we're going to do is glaze the skin using some contrast paint from Citadel, and I've got two. First of all, I've got Nazdreg Yellow, which is the most important one, but I'm also going to add some little bits of Volupus Pink to make it appear kind of sore in certain areas, and you'll see how in just a moment. Now to apply this, what I'm going to be doing is using a medium layer brush from Citadel, and I am going to dilute this with a little bit of water. You can paint this onto the miniature straight out the pot if you want to, but the colour's going to be much more intense this way, and I want to allow myself to have a bit more control over it, you see, because if I want to make the yellow more intense in certain areas, this way I can apply another coat without overwhelming the green. So I do recommend doing it. So just little bits of water mixed in there like that, so it's a bit thinner. Then just make sure my brush isn't overloaded with it. What I'm going to do is just load it with some of this and then paint this directly over the skin. So I'll start up here on the arm. What I'm going to do is just run it over like this, and you can see immediately it has quite a dramatic effect on the skin, shifting it much more towards yellow and making it look really, really gross. Now here we can see what the Volupus Pink is for, because I can make certain areas appear a bit more sore, and I think the crook of the elbow is a great place to do that. To do this, just get a tiny bit of Volupus Pink, and all I do is just run it in there. I've not even actually washed my brush for this. I'm just dotting a tiny bit in like that, and then I'm just sort of smearing it into the colours around it so it mixes with them, and you can see it gives a nice subtle effect then and makes it appear really, really horrible in that area. So what I'm going to do now is just carry on doing this all over the skin, just painting it onto all the flesh, picking one area at a time, and just completing that whole part before I move on to the next one. Now it's worth noticing that when you do this, when you get to certain finer details such as on the face, just really take your time around here and be careful of the teeth, but be sure to catch those lighter areas of flesh to the lower lip and the eyelid. And with that, the skin is complete, and now we can move on to the next detail, which is to go back to that armour because it's time to really rust it up and add some colour to it. For this we need two colours. First of all, some Skrag Brown from Citadel, followed by another paint from Citadel, a very small amount of Ungor Flesh. But first of all we need that Skrag Brown, and to apply this I'm going to use Citadel's small layer brush. And to get this ready and to do the effect, what we're going to do is get some onto the palette and then heavily water it down. So a really good amount of water mixed in like this, so you get a very, very runny version of the paint. And then what we're going to do is just get some of this. And on your miniature, just consider areas where liquid would collect if you was out in the rain, for example. So it's going to be in recessed areas where it would all stick. And all we do is just run this into those areas like that, so it stains it with this kind of orangey brown colour, like that. It's just as simple as that. Now you can really do as much or as little of this as you like. And you can actually use it to help separate some of these armour plates a bit more by making them, some of them very, very rusty and some of them mostly silver. But really you can see it's just a matter of just putting this on and just letting it build up. And like all weathering effects, it's always a good idea to just gradually add more and more of this until you're happy. Once you're happy with that darker rust colour, it's then time to move on to some Ungor Flesh, which I've thinned down in just the same way, and you can see now I'm applying it with my detail brush, because with this what I'm looking to do is just paint very small little amounts of this into the areas where the paint is, or the rust is most concentrated. So areas just along there, just very small amounts. And because it's thin, it's very easy just to play around with it once you've applied it and to just work it into that texture in just little amounts like this, just to make the rust more intense where there's more of it collected. And with that, we've now finished painting the Super Mutant itself, and all we need to do is to paint the textured base of the miniature. And to do this, the first thing we need to do is to neaten up any concrete on it using some Mechanicus Standard Grey. After that, we can pick out some details, first of all using Baneblade Brown for any dirt, followed by some dried bark for any wood that's on there. Now with that done, we're then ready to wash all over the base, and for this we're going to use both Agrax Earthshade and Athonian Camber Shade at the same time and let them mix. And finally, to finish it off, we'll lightly dry brush it using a little bit of Screaming Skull. But first of all, we need Mechanicus Standard Grey, and I'm going back to my regiment brush to apply this because it's quite a large area and we don't have to worry about being too neat here at this stage. So you just need to get that paint ready, as we have been doing, and then it's just a matter of applying this to the concrete, and it's mostly going to be around the feet of the miniature. You can see where all the paint is kind of splashed onto it. All I've got to do is just carefully move up to the feet like that, and then just cover the area around it. Next, we're ready to look for any patches of dirt and then base coat it using Baneblade Brown, for example the one that we've got around here. Next, look for any wood, and if you spot any, base coat it using dried bark, for example these planks that we've got on the front of the base just here. With our base coats now done on the base, we're now ready to wash it using two washers, starting out with Agrax Earthshade, which I'm going to paint on in large areas like this using a medium shade brush from Citadel. And once you've applied a certain amount, just start adding in some random little bits of Athonian Camo Shade. And what this is going to do is add a greenish hint to things and just make it appear a little bit more lifelike. And once that wash is completely dry, you're then ready to finish off the base with a light dry brush of Screaming Skull. And this time I'm using a regular dry brush from the Army Painter to do this, and you'll see it just adds a nice highlight and brings all the colours together, bringing out that texture as you go. And I'm just being really careful as I apply it of the miniature's feet as well. Now once you've done this, if you want to, you can add a grass tuft or two to the base, and then you just need to paint the rim. And this can be any colour that you like, but for this miniature I'm going to be using dried bark. And with that base now fully painted, this Super Mutant is complete and ready to go and search for things to eat and of course kill in the Wasteland. So as you've seen with these miniatures, the real key feature of them is of course their skin. So remember with this, the real finishing touch of it is when you put that glazing at the end to add the colour to it. And you can play around with this to get lots of different tones, and in fact it's a really fun thing to do across your entire warband. But we really hope you've enjoyed this video and have fun painting your Super Mutants, and we'll see you all again very soon.